Yep, it's time to troubleshoot the most common question in all of FPV. My drone flips over when I arm it. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. And I'm not exaggerating when I say this is the most common question in all of FPV. Like, I can't prove it, but this is a thing that every beginner, as they get into the world of FPV, will experience, and they won't really understand why it's happening. And it turns out that there are 4 things that you have to check. And if you check all 4 of those things and they're all correct, then this problem won't happen. Let's talk generally about what causes this problem to happen. And here's the thing. We got a drone. And the flight controller needs to know that when I make this motor go faster, the drone will tilt this way. Because this motor go faster, this motor make more thrust, the drone tilts this way. When I make this motor go slower, the drone tilts this way. And it needs to know that for all 4 of its motors so that when the drone is tilting a certain way and you want it to tilt the other way, or when you put a stick input in and the flight controller goes, oh, we need to roll to the right, it knows that I make these 2 motors go faster and these 2 motors go slower, and the drone will roll to the right. And this problem that we're describing in this video happens when there is a disconnect between those things. That the flight controller wants to make the quadcopter roll to the right, and for some reason it's confused and it makes the right-hand motors speed up. And what happens is that then the quadcopter rolls to the left. And the flight controller goes, no, I said roll to the right. So it makes the motors go faster. And so the quadcopter rolls to the left even faster. And the flight controller says, no, I said roll to the right. And it makes the motors go even faster. And what you get is a feedback loop, where the flight controller gives the wrong input to the motors, the quadcopter moves the wrong way, and that sets up the feedback loop that then results in a freak out. Now, the good news is that Betaflight has a function called runaway protection that detects when this is happening and instantly disarms the quadcopter. It's not foolproof, but as you could see from the examples that I showed you earlier in the video, it works pretty good. And it didn't used to be there. Before Betaflight invented that, what would happen is the quadcopter would just go and freak out. It would fly 30 feet in one direction or spin around like a Tasmanian devil until you hit the disarm switch, and it could move pretty fast and do some damage before that happened. I personally had one fly right by my head. And I was like, okay, well, I guess my props are on wrong. Ooh, I've just spoilered what one of the 4 things is. So the good news is that Betaflight will almost always detect this and disarm before things get too bad. But you want to be careful when you're doing your first arming check on a new build. You'll see people do it in their living room or in their kitchen. And sometimes when things are wrong, instead of just disarming, it'll go and shoot to the moon and put a hole in your ceiling. So definitely do your first hover checks outdoors. Don't just do it in your kitchen or something. It can get really ugly. And that brings us to the first reason why your quadcopter might be flipping out. For this one, the flight controller is upside down. It's flipped 180 on the roll axis. When you try to fly, your flight controller alignment. You see, the flight controller needs to be installed in the frame facing forward. Every flight controller is going to have a forward-facing arrow on it, and if you don't install it facing forward, then you're going to get this problem. But you can still get this problem sometimes even if the flight controller is facing forward. Some flight controllers come from the manufacturer, and their Betaflight target is not set up quite right, or the gyro is not aligned right. There's a basic check that you can do to see if this problem is affecting you. Here's what it is. We're going to plug USB into the flight controller, and we're going to go into Betaflight. We're going to go to the Setup tab. We're going to look at this 3D model here, and we're going to see if this 3D model correctly represents the orientation and movement of the quadcopter. And you can see right here that immediately we have a problem. The quadcopter's right side up. The 3D model is upside down. And what some of you guys are going to be tempted to do is hit the calibrate accelerometer button, because calibrate accelerometer tells the flight controller which way is up. But that's not the right thing to do. Let's do it. If I say calibrate accelerometer, it's going to calibrate and the 3D model will flip right side up. But it's not right side up. The accelerometer is reading right side up, but the gyro is still upside down. That's not right. Here's the right way to fix it. What we need to do is go in the configuration tab, and we need to look at the board and sensor alignment section. And in this case, The roll degrees is set to 180. What that means is that we've told the flight controller that is flipped over 180 degrees on the roll axis. Now, if I had installed this flight controller upside down, that would be the right thing to do. That's how I would fix it. The flight controller is upside down. I virtually flip it back over again and everything is fine. In this case, I did that on purpose so I could generate those beautiful freak out videos that you saw at the beginning of the video. So let's set this back to 0 and save and reboot. So now you can see that if I tilt the quadcopter forward, it tilts forward. If I tilt it to the right, it tilts right. If I tilt it to the left, it tilts to the left. And if I yaw it left and right, the movements of the quadcopter on screen exactly match the movements of the quadcopter in my hand. That is what we're checking for. I want to call your attention to the Reset Z-axis button right here. This is misleading. People think that if the flight controller is like installed backwards, if I just hit the Reset Z-axis, it'll flip it around and now it's facing forward. That's not what that does. All the Reset Z-axis does is make the quadcopter on screen appear to face away from you. It doesn't change the configuration of the flight controller at all. So like if I plugged in the quadcopter and it was facing this way and now it doesn't jibe with my 3D model, that's a little confusing. So I'm just going to point the quadcopter straight at the screen, hit Reset Z-axis, and now everything lines up. And that's what we want. Okay, and upside down, all is correct. Now I'm going to go screw this up again. Okay, I'm going to screw this up. The most common way this is screwed up is the yaw alignment, where the flight controller is right side up, but it is cocked 45 degrees or 90 degrees. It's not facing forward. So like a common way for this to be screwed up would be like if yaw was off by 90 degrees and like we installed the flight controller facing sideways or something. And what we would get there is that when I tilt it on the pitch axis, the 3D model rolls. When I tilt it on the roll axis, the 3D model pitches. So roll and pitch are swapped, but the yaw axis is correct. That tells you that your flight controller is off by 90 degrees. And if I go to the configuration tab, the other thing that can commonly happen is that it's flipped upside down. And in that case, what you'll see is that yaw will be backwards. So if I flip it upside down, 180 degrees, save and reboot. And then let's calibrate accelerometer to confuse ourselves even more. So now it appears to be right side up. Do you see that when I roll to the left and roll to the right, that's correct. When I pitch forward and back though, it's reversed. And when I yaw left and right, it's also reversed. That means we're flipped on the roll axis. So roll is correct, but pitch and yaw have been reversed. That tells us that the flight controller is upside down. You don't need to memorize all these different permutations, although if you do it long enough, you will memorize them and you'll just be like, oh, I see, the flight controller is upside down. Basically, what you need to do is if that 3D model doesn't move right, you need to come here and you need to figure out the correct number of transformations to get it to move right, to move correctly. That's what you need to do. It will almost always be increments of 90 degrees, right? Because the flight controller is almost always installed on a 90. However, some 25mm flight controllers are installed with 45 degree orientation. And so you may be messing around with 45, 135, etc. It gets a little more complicated. The other thing I want to point out to you is that we have an orientation for the flight controller as a whole, and there's orientation for the gyro chips themselves. Now, usually the gyro orientation is going to be correct from the manufacturer. This is set to CW90 flip. I don't know why. That's just what happened when I flashed it, and I assume that's correct. However, you can get situations where this is incorrect, and then that means you have to start mucking around here with the flight controller to sort of undo the incorrect alignment here. So anyway, the 3D model has to move correctly. And if it doesn't, adjust it with these 3 parameters. Next, we're going to go to the Motors tab, and we're going to need to plug in a battery, because the next thing we're going to check is that the motor, it's called motor mapping, but basically the motor position or motor order is another thing they call it. Basically that what Betaflight thinks is motor number 1 is actually motor number 1, and vice versa, and so on. So for this one, I have screwed up the motor order. So the quadcopter doesn't know which motors, basically the motors aren't where the quadcopter thinks they are. So far so good. Raising throttle. Yeah, the old classic. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the Motors tab, we're going to plug a battery in, we're going to make sure our props are taken off, and we're going to say, I understand the risks, the propellers are removed. And then we're going to raise the motor sliders one by one, and we're going to see which motor spins. Now, in fact, there's a better way to do this. We can just skip that step. Because what we actually can do, in the same time it would take us to check whether the motors are mapped correctly, we can just map them correctly by using the reorder motors wizard. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to hit reorder motors. We're going to say, I understand the risk, propellers are removed. We're going to hit start, and then one by one, we're going to click on, we're going to click on the spinning motor. OMG, the wrong motor is spinning. So whatever, doesn't matter. We just click on the motor that's spinning, and Betaflight will fix it for us. We save. We know that our motor order is correct, having done that. That's just done. In fact, I run this on every new build that I do, even if I'm sure that if you wire up the ESC correctly, it should be correct. But in the time it would take me to check that it's correct, I can just run the wizard, and then I know it's correct, and then that's it. The third thing that can cause this is the direction of the motors. So we said that Betaflight needs to know that when this motor goes faster, this arm will go up, and when it goes slower, that arm goes down, and vice versa. Betaflight needs to know which motor moves the quadcopter which way. And of course, if the motor is spinning the wrong direction, it will be pushing thrust the wrong direction. Not only that, but the direction that the motors cause the quadcopter to yaw depends on their direction. So the motors have to be spinning the direction that the flight controller thinks that they're spinning. For this one, the back right motor is spinning the wrong direction. We go to the Motors tab, and first thing we do is we look at this diagram. And you will have decided at build time whether you want your quadcopter to be props in or props out. That is, standard or reverse direction. Or it will have come from the manufacturer and it will have been set a certain way. What we're going to do first is we're going to look at this and we're going to see if this is how we want it to be. And if you don't have an opinion, just leave it the way that it is. But if you're intending to build a racing drone with props out rotation and you look and you see this, well, that's props in rotation. That's not what you want. So you're going to go ahead and correct that. Now that that is how you want it to be, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to hit motor direction. And again, we need to have the props off and a battery plugged in, and we're going to hit the wizard. And when we hit the wizard, the first thing we're going to do is hit start spin motors, and all of the motors will begin to spin. And then we're going to check the motor rotation. And again, very careful. You have to check by looking at this graph. Don't go based off your memory, because sometimes what you remember isn't what the flight controller remembers. You guys might not be on the same page, and that's why your quadcopter is flipping out. So I'm going to look at motor number 1, the back right motor. And I like to use a little, this is a little brush that came with my keyboard to clean the keyboard, but whatever. I use a dollar bill, use a business card, I use a zip tie, because I can't always tell just by touching the motor which direction it's spinning. So I'm just going to put the brush on here, and I can see that that is spinning the wrong way. It's spinning man, this thing is completely effed up. So I'm just going to click 1. And then now it's spinning the correct way. Great. Now motor number 2. Motor number 2 is spinning the correct way. It matches the diagram. Motor number 3 is spinning the correct way. It matches the diagram. Motor number 4 is spinning the wrong way. It does not match the diagram. And now motor number 4 is spinning the correct way. Once all 4 motors are spinning the correct way, we hit stop motors, and that is it. That's it for that step. Now, there's 2 ways that this problem can occur. One of them is that you've just sort of randomly got one of your motors spinning the wrong way, and that results in a diagonal freakout when you try to arm. The other is that you have got all your motors spinning the right direction, but you screwed this setting up. You set your motors up to spin props out as intended, but you forgot to tick this box, and the flight controller thinks that the motors are spinning props in. And in that specific case, what happens is the quad kind of pops up in the air, does like a 90-degree turn to the side, and settles back down again. There you go. As soon as I arm, it does that. And that's very recognizable. When you see that, it's almost always going to be that you've got this setting backwards from how the motors are actually spinning, and you kind of want to recognize that. At this point, your flight controller, your ESC, and your motors are all configured correctly, and your quadcopter should fly as long as you don't do the 4th thing you can do that commonly screws this up, which is put your props on wrong. And what you need to know is that there are clockwise and counterclockwise spinning props, and there are clockwise and counterclockwise spinning motors, and those 2 have to be together. If you put a counterclockwise prop on a clockwise spinning motor or vice versa, what basically happens is that the motor pushes thrust the wrong way. Instead of pushing thrust down, it pushes thrust up, and then the quadcopter won't fly. And it was pretty interesting to run this test because the first test that I ran, I put all 4 props on wrong. And when I throttled up, the quadcopter didn't actually freak out. I'm just going to raise throttle. It's angry. So just raising throttle, it just sort of pushes into the ground. Now I'm going to try to yaw. Okay, it will yaw to the sides. What about pitch and roll? No, it just won't take off. It's not freaking out, but it won't take off. That was roll left, right. Because what it was doing was pushing thrust up, and it was pushing the quadcopter, just basically slamming it down against the ground as hard as it could. And so there was it couldn't freak out and get itself off the ground. It just went and wouldn't take off. So if you've got a quadcopter that won't take off at all, that's maybe the problem. All 4 of your props may be on wrong. The second test that I did, I put the correct props on the front and the wrong props on the rear. And I don't know, I guess that's possible. And what happened surprised me. Woo. Interesting. So the front wants to lift off, but the rear does not. And the PID controller is keeping it in check. It's not letting the front get too far up. It's like, this isn't right. But it's not flipping out. Let's try a little yaw. Whoop, there we went. All right. Well, we put a little yaw and it did flip over. The quadcopter started to lift up the front. So it's lifting up the front and pushing down in the rear. So obviously it can't fly. But it didn't just go whoop and flip over. The flight controller went, something ain't right here. I'm not supposed to be pitching back. And then it just kind of froze like this and wouldn't go any further. And eventually, if I continued to push the throttle and continued to push the pitch stick, it did flip over. But I expected it to freak out more, and I guess it didn't. The same thing happened when I put 1 incorrect prop on the back right, I believe it was. The quadcopter started to lift off. These 3 motors were making thrust the correct way. This one was not. And then it kind of just froze there. And again, I could get it to flip over if I really pushed it, but it didn't just immediately freak out like it did in many of the other examples. Now, this is the part of the video where you get very annoyed at me. Some of you will. Because you're watching this video, presumably because you're having this problem. Your quadcopter is freaking out. It won't fly. And you've gone through this video looking for a solution, and you've checked all of the things I told you to check, and none of them have fixed it. You've done all the things, your quadcopter still won't fly. And I'm sorry to tell you, it's one of those 4 things. You've almost certainly just overlooked it. And the reason you're annoyed is because you're sure that you didn't do that. And I'm going to just trust me. I've been doing this for many years, and I've helped many people through this exact situation, exactly like you. And I can't tell you how many times they say, I checked all those things, that's not it. And I say, go check again. And they go check again. And the second or third or maybe 4th or 5th time they check, they realize, oh, you said the motors needed to spin the right direction and I didn't. Like, there's some miscommunication between what I'm telling you and what your brain is hearing and what you're doing. It's one of those 4 things. And that doesn't help you, except that you just got to try to figure out where what I'm saying isn't being interpreted right by your brain. But it's one of those 4 things. It's always, almost always, one of those 4 things. On the other hand, if I helped you solve your problem and your quadcopter's flying now, can I remind you I have a Patreon? Patreon is one of the best ways to support the work that I do here and make sure I can continue to do it by paying my bills and feeding my family. There's a fly in here. Patreon, basically what you do is you go to the website and you sign up and you put your credit card number and you put your PayPal in or whatever, and you subscribe to me for $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned it. The amount you subscribe at is totally up to you, but the minimum tier is $2 a month. You pick however much you think that my content is worth for you. I don't charge you for it. I just trust that if you're getting value out of it, eventually you'll decide to pay me back. And if today is the day that you're like, yeah, you know what, this guy, all right, fine, you got me. The link's down below. I'd love to have you as a supporter. I'll see you there.